All right. So welcome, everyone, to the first of 3 Talk Story Lunch Hours. We will have another one on June 5th, and then the next one on June 25th. And the purpose of these is basically, a less formal conversation about the study. We're not going to bore you with a lengthy presentation, although we may, provide some quick updates for you. But this is mainly for us to have a conversation about it and for you to ask questions and let us know what you think. I want to acknowledge that we didn't get a word out about today's Talk Story Lunch Hour through all of the channels that we usually try to use, including the mailing list that most of you are signed up for. If you haven't signed up for it yet, please do go to the website, honolulu.gov/alawai, sign up for that. We try to send out notice through the mailing list, and we also try to put updated information on the website. That didn't happen this time, and apologies for that. We did get some word out through social media and through the mayor's town hall, and we mentioned it on our last meeting, but we will, going forward, be sure to also get the word out through the email list and the website. So I want to apologize for that up front. We do have 2 more of these happening, so folks that didn't hear about it or couldn't make it, there are going to be 2 more, so hopefully that will be good. So before we get into the discussion, just to let you know who is here. So myself, I'll be facilitating as usual. Brian, the acting deputy director of the Department of Design and Construction. Actually, I think he's no longer acting, right? He's permanent. You're permanent, right, Brian? Okay.
Yes,
right on.
permanent.
So Brian's here from the city and county, and from the Corps of Engineers, we have Cindy Akbal. She's the project manager located in Honolulu. Eric Merriam is our study lead, and Kelly Philbin is our technical lead. So last time, Kelly wasn't able to join us. We had a lot of technical questions that people asked, as well as other questions that were not technical that we were able to answer. And the team has recorded all of those questions. There were many, many, many. And so we are compiling a document with answers to those questions now. We will post that to the website and probably send it out also through the mailing list by the end of this week, so that you will have those answers. Recognize, obviously, that's not in time for today's meeting, so if you have repeat questions, that's totally fine. We'll try to answer them on this meeting as best we can. Just some reminders of our ground rules for our discussion. You know how this goes. If you have a question or a comment, you can put it in the chat. You can use your raise hand tool. Keep your audio on mute when you're not speaking. I think we recognize most of you here, but if you want to introduce yourself briefly the first time you talk, that would be great. And I don't think we're probably going to need a time limit, considering that we don't have a lot of folks on, but do, be mindful that other people may want to speak, and we don't have a ton of time, this being only an hour long. So just be mindful of that. And then one last thing that I wanted to remind us as we get into this discussion, actually 2 quick things. One is that there was, I think, a little bit of concern, kind of reading between the lines at our last meeting, that the public comment period, the NEPA specified public comment period, which ended on May 8th, I think people may have been concerned that that meant we were going to stop listening to the public on May 8th. And that's absolutely not the case. That's why we are having this meeting and the rest of these informal meetings. And we continue to accept comments via the website comment form and the email address, alawai@honolulu.gov. So that continues, absolutely. It just happens that the NEPA specified comment period is over. So we're kind of between those comment periods now. And then, I'll go to the next slide so you can see. So then we're going to have in July a notice of availability of the draft report will be published in the Federal Register. The draft report will detail the tentatively selected plan. That NOA publishing will kick off a 45-day, minimum 45-day NEPA specified public comment period, another one, okay? So lots of opportunities for you to make your voice heard about the shape of this plan. And then we're also gonna have a couple of full-on workshops around that when that draft report is published. Okay, I could continue with other things that people raised at our last meeting, but I'm gonna go ahead and stop prattling and open the floor. Actually, before I do that, let me just ask Eric real quick. Do you have anything you wanna add, Eric?
No, Tyson, I think you did a good job setting the stage. Just looking forward to the discussion today. Over.
Great. Okay. So I see, Dave, you've asked some questions in the chat. It looks like Kelly is answering those in the chat. Feel free to chime in verbally or raise your hand if you want to ask that way. So Anthony asks, when's your next in-person presentation? Will we be presenting the draft plan in person or online? So in person will be, it's looking like July. I mean, it's going to be right after we publish the draft report and the NOA. So that should be sometime in July. We don't, know exact dates yet, but we'll do that in person, and we'll also have a virtual one as well. So we'll do both virtual and in person in July. Dave asked a question about flood modeling software. I actually had a question. Before I ask my question, I'll let Laura ask hers. Laura, I see you raise your hand.
Hi, Dave's questions are very important to understand, so I would defer to him. But let me say that I've been a resident of Mo'ili'ili since 1980, before that across in Kapahulu and all. But I have been watching the Alawai Canal and the Manoa Stream and all of the park and golf course areas. I know, and I've seen when waters rise. I know all of the variables of from high tides to hurricanes, tsunamis. I walked every inch of it. This is what I would like to ask you is, the governor said at this town hall meeting the other day that he is committed to the top hole golf. Anyway, that's in the middle of the golf course, I believe. At the time that might be undertaken, my plan has been all along is to scoop out the major portion of the golf course at the end of the Eva end, about 3 feet down. You roll up the grass turf and you lower it. Then you prepare for the incoming water, should it come, as a great detention basin, a huge detention basin that should, I believe, solve almost all of the major problems at the lower end and protect the cash cow of Waikiki. And that would be at the time that the water is filled up at the detention basin, and should there be an outflow, it's a very small little pump that just goes out into the canal and lets the water ease out. I might add, if you remember the sewage spill some years ago in Waikiki, if a small pump had not been put in there, it would have been a catastrophe of sewage all over Waikiki. Instead, they pumped it down the canal. So this would be the same things, a very, very small generator and pump that would take excess water after the danger is over and pump it down there. This would mean that there really would not be, I mean, I have proposals for very low flood walls on the Waikiki side only, but I can come back in and talk about that more. But I really think that that needs to be considered as the major detention basin of the lower 3 feet, and then with a pump out, and the canal or the OI that will travel it in will be taken care of somewhere between the Kaimuki High School athletic field and the golf course. And I might add that I hope you're aware of it, but the edge of the athletic field at Kaimuki High School on the Diamond Head side, it's an irregular edge. That actually is the ancient Pahoa stream that went down to join there were 3 other streams down in Waikiki, but anyway, it was a traditional flowing plan, and I believe that that small ditch or OI that connects with the Manoa Stream now is a very viable way of also extending into the detention basin. So if some of you can respond to that, I really think that it's an important way to go for containing huge amounts of water and also for saving all of our surrounding neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Kelly, I know that you're sort of probably dividing your attention between the chat and verbal comments. Were you able to catch that? Is that something that we've looked at, or is that something we could incorporate in what we have looked at in terms of the detention basin and the Alawai golf course?
So Tyson, I was concentrating on responding to the chat. From what I recall, was that dredging part of the golf course to account for more storage, or can you please summarize that for me?
Do you want me to continue?
Yeah, Laura, if you could just real quickly summarize again your proposal.
The Alawai golf course at the Eva end, the large portion of the golf course, the turf would be rolled up and soil, or it's actually fill scooped out, the turf returned, and the plan for the diversion from the Manoa Stream into that detention basin when it's needed. The outflow would be as time required later, with a small pump house, very small pump house, and the apparatus to keep it flowing. And I will just reiterate, if you remember the huge sewage spill that happened in Waikiki some years ago, and they had a small pump and it pumped the sewage, I hate to say it, right into the canal, but it took care of any problem that would be happening. I would really recommend a small pump that would be at the other end. Thank you. Can you respond? Thank you.
Yes, I can. Thanks for that question. So actually, we did model something very similar to that. There were a lot of great ideas from the community, returning that area to a wetland, making it a lagoon. And so I actually, my background is a hydraulic engineer, water resources engineer. And so I was kind of helping the team with some of the modeling. And I kind of was creative in it and created some waterway systems, did some dredging, but because of sea level rise and groundwater infiltration, it did not make a difference to reduce any flood risk. So I took it one step further and I dredged the entire golf course. I pretended it wasn't there, and it still really made minimal impact because of the sea level rise for future conditions. So yes, we have looked into it. Unfortunately, it just did not provide a lot of benefit, but I think that's a great question, great idea. I would love for a lagoon of sorts to happen, but the flood risk component was not there.
Laura, you want to follow up?
Yeah, if I could follow, yeah. Judith Silgenbauer proposed the wetlands. I was not exactly proposing wetlands, although there could be some at the edge of Eva. But what you're suggesting, if you're talking, and you seem to be more concerned about sea level rise and all of those other concerns, but then put a small wall, if you want. I'd rather suggest a berm around the edge of the Alawai golf course. That will contain another you know, you people that know all of the measurements and everything, would contain another 3 feet, and it shouldn't be more than 3 feet of water detention. And that would be a very easy fix, I think, to what would be the containment of the water coming downstream and also account for the sea level rise. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so just to add to that, it's the groundwater infiltration from the tide. So it's just the groundwater table, the aquifer. And so really you wouldn't have that amount of storage that typically you would have, say, if it was higher up in the watershed with a lower aquifer. So that's why sea level rise plays a big part in the analysis and the storage available at the golf course.
Yeah, and Laura, I think so. I'm not a hydraulic engineer, but so when we were visiting the island, there was actually a king tide, and when we were on the golf course during that king tide, you actually had water seeping up through the ground, and so there were these pools of water in the middle of the golf course because water was essentially coming up through the ground, and so you know, if you can't dredge because of that, right? So you're essentially just like lowering it down and that would fill up with the water. And so as the sea level rise and the tide rises, right, that water table just shifts upward. And so that's just kind of a way that I use to understand that kind of concept. It's not like you would have sea level rise causing spillage over the canal. It actually like seeps up through the ground into the golf course, if that makes sense. Over.
Okay, if I might suggest, then move your ideas up to the Kaimuki High School athletic field. It's a huge, large area. It does need undergoing a good renovation anyway, and lower it 3 feet there. And if you need to put some small berms around it, also it's probably 10 to 15 feet higher than the actual golf course level. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Appreciate that suggestion. And I wanted to, you also mentioned the walls, and I see some Dave and others talking about the walls a bit. And that was actually the question that I had for Kelly. So one thing that we have tried to emphasize, you know, in these meetings and elsewhere is that the height of 6 feet is an initial assumption, right? And we don't know yet, as we get closer to the actual design phase, what the height is actually going to be. And of course, also the fact that the shape could be many different things and we can work on the aesthetics of it. But the question that I had actually for Kelly was, when you are doing that initial analysis of modeling in the software of, you know, how is the structure going to affect inundation, does this software actually, are you actually like doing different models for a wall versus a berm? Or are you just like modeling that there's going to be something there that's going to stop the water? And as far as the software is concerned, it could be a force field, it could be a wall, it could be, you know, any number of things. Just curious about that level of detail when you're working on in the early stages.
I guess that's a tough question to answer. There's a lot of different ways you can model it. And so we can manipulate the terrain that we're using to account for like a levee. We could do, you know, we could just simulate it with a wall. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways that we can model it, but every single change to the model we make takes a lot of time, and running it through all the different rain events to determine the performance of that flood risk measure. So there's a lot of time that goes into every individual measure and alternative.
Okay, and the reason that I'm asking that really is because, you know, we've been using this term flood walls even for areas where I think a berm or, you know, other structures could possibly work. And so I just wanted to basically reiterate for folks that even if we say the word flood wall, it doesn't necessarily mean for certain areas that's, that it's going to be like a vertical concrete thing. It could look very different from that. And I see, Laura, I'll come back to you when I get to a couple more questions in the chat first. I see Luciano asked, how's the floodwater sent into the Alawai Golf Course detention basin instead of Mo'iliili and Waikiki? How is it sent there instead of into those other areas, and what are the specific design features that make that successful?
Yeah, so this is one of the questions that came up on the April 24 meeting that I provided a response to that we're going to share. But to summarize, for the tentatively selected plan, with the use of flood walls on the left and right bank of the Manoa Palolo Canal, and then you have the levee kind of encompassing the golf course. We're going to be utilizing, maintaining that water in the stream, and when water levels rise to over bankful, it will start to draining into kind of this detention basin we've created with the levee around the golf course. And so there's no concrete structure that's going to divert it. It's really just going to be, there's already a low-lying there's a low-lying drainage ditch there already, and so we're going to modify that, or the plan is to modify that slightly, add some erosion control in that area, and be able to safely divert the water onto the golf course from there. So it's a system, and it's utilizing the flood walls that are in place. It keeps the water in the system, and then when water rises above bankful, it will start to gently flood the golf course.
Thanks. Anthony asked if we're looking at retractable walls. I know that I've seen some emails going back and forth about that. So I think the answer is yes. But Kelly, what would you say?
Yeah, so, probably August of 2021, around that time frame when we had the kickoff. We came up with a lot of ideas for different types of flood wall systems, whether that's retractable, like the flood break kind, where it kind of goes up at an angle. There's the kind that rises vertically. There are glass flood walls. There's a lot of different types that we did look at. And ultimately, there were a lot of maintenance issues with them. There's currently some projects that the Corps somehow approved them. They normally don't approve really innovative flood walls like that. But there happens to be some maintenance issues. So if debris gets in that hydraulic system, then, that's your source of failure at that point. So we really stick to a more traditional design, traditional typical flood wall cross-section, but we have flexibility in the aesthetics of it and the usage of it. But we have looked into retractable. It's just not something that the Corps will typically approve for various reasons, but life safety is number one.
Gotcha. And just so you know, Anthony, I'm a sociologist, but I've been sort of a fly on the wall for some of these conversations. And like one of the other issues, maintenance related to that maintenance issue that Kelly said is that that hydraulic system that the retractable wall depends on would require penetrating the existing walls of the canal. I assume you're talking about the Alawai Canal, right? And there already are some concerns about the stability of those walls. So that would be a pretty major issue. So let me, I know, Laura, you've got something else. Let me first go to Dave, because Dave's got a lot of questions in the chat. So Dave, let me give you a chance to say something verbally, if you would, if you want to, focus on a particular question, and then we'll get to Laura. Dave, you want to come off mute? Or you just want to stay in the chat, that's also fine. Okay, well, let's go to Laura then, and then we'll come back to you, Dave.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to say that the mayor objects to the complete streets closing further down the Ollawai Boulevard, and that would be a concern of complete streets. If you folks have any power at all, you would tell the complete streets to hold off doing that area. And the second of all, if you would ask the city and county to relegate the ill-proposed bridge over the canal to the archives in the basement of the Fosse building, because there are many plans that are already there that never got built, because that will also severely impact any kind of movement that's on the Waikiki side and the Mauka side of the canal. And those two are, people are not speaking to each other, but if you could get those two things stopped, that would be a great advantage. I would just fill in what Kelly is suggesting, berms, levees, like it could be very small, 3-foot levees with very decorative wall. And I've suggested taking the pattern of the wall that's the native rocks, which is further downstream, across past the Macaulay Bridge, and using that as another 3-foot way in which you protect the Waikiki area, and you can also protect the Mo'ili'ili area. But actually, Mo'ili'ili is not really going to flood extensively. Over my time from 1980 on, I've only seen it overflow maybe once again in the Iolani school area, and maybe a few other times when it did run into the Ollawai school. But those are very temporary and can be fixed very easily with berms around the schools. Thank you. Can Kelly respond? Kelly, respond.
Thanks, Laura. What do you think, Kelly? And Brian might want to comment as well, or feel free, Brian, if you want to jump in about the city's side.
Yeah, we have the Department of Transportation Services in our meetings, and we are looking at integrating the bridge across the Ollawai into the walls as well. So currently, it looks like the bridge is going to start design. It's all preliminary for now. What the Army Corps is going through now is it's just pure planning. There's nothing really set for actual design or construction. It's just trying to figure out how all these pieces integrate together. But yeah, we do have funding set aside for the bridge. But yeah, as we get DTS involved and we move forward with this project, we don't have a choice. We have to coordinate and work together to evaluate what is feasible and what actually works. So that's a fair comment. No one can deny, Laura, what you're saying. They have to work together, and it has to be evaluated to see what is best for the area and Waikiki and Honolulu. So thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Kelly or Eric, want to respond to the other parts?
Yeah. So yeah, I was just going to echo the same thing, in that we've had numerous meetings, with the specialized, well, I say specialized, with the, teams for each of those projects, and in terms of how we can make our effort and their efforts kind of sync up with one another and make sure we're working together moving forward. So agree that we've got a great relationship there. And with respect to the design of the flood wall, so there are a number of ways that we are seeking to ensure that it's not just a concrete wall, right? So one is that there is guidance and policy within the Corps of Engineers that says that features that improve the aesthetics of these walls are integral components of the project, meaning that they will be cost shared and incorporated. And so, Laura, like you mentioned, things like the facade, right? The lava rock type wall that can be incorporated as as an aesthetic feature through that policy. I think on one of the last public meetings, or maybe it was one of the public comments that came in through the email, there were concerns about, from the environmental impact statement standpoint, impacts associated with the view shed, right? And so yes, we've talked a lot about, through the EIS the environmental impacts, right? What's the flood wall going to do to get to the riparian areas? What are the aquatic impacts going to be? But we also need to consider things like the impacts to the viewshed and other cultural impacts. And so, we are absolutely taking that into consideration. And so one of the things that we are looking to do is we've talked a lot about the elevated walkway right behind the flood wall. So we can have a flood wall, but then you have an elevated walkway that would allow, people to see over. So it'd be a 3-foot wall at that point, essentially on top of a 3-foot elevated walkway. And so we are looking to incorporate that as mitigation, right, for the impacts to the viewshed. And so we are looking at multiple avenues to make sure that we incorporate features that minimize the overall impact to the community. And so I just kind of wanted to, you had mentioned various aspects of or various things that we could do to improve the aesthetics and minimize the impact. And so those are just some things that we're looking at and designing into the project right now.
Thanks, Eric. And Laura, I just want to note your request there in the chat to provide updates on the working with about the bridge and stuff. So we'll certainly, make sure to give you those updates in future meetings as, things develop.
And Tyson, I can speak to that really quickly, just as an example, right? And so with the flood walls, the walls that we're looking at designing, right, they have to be set back. So this is just an example. They have to be set back from the existing walls a little bit, right? And so clearly, if we set the walls back, it could kind of move into the boulevard and the complete streets project that's also being undertaken. And so we've had discussions about, okay, well, what would the setback need to be? How might that impact these other projects? How might we be able to integrate them in together to minimize impact overall and maximize benefits? So can we have them work together in certain ways? And so we've had discussions on that. And then also, clearly with the bridge project, if a bridge will be implemented, it needs to, if we have a wall, it needs to be integrated, an integral feature of the wall, right? Or, they need to make sure that they design the bridge in such a way that it would not impact the viability of our wall and vice versa, right? And so we've had some initial discussions, and those discussions were ongoing in the previous iteration as well, but we've continued those discussions as we've started to get further and further into kind of our conceptual design, looking at how those two things would need to work together. And I'll apologize up front that I'm getting ready to travel, so I'm in an airport, and so if you hear some background noise, that's what it is. Over.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, as Eric just mentioned, and as you said, Laura, we are keenly, acutely aware of how important the viewshed is and the aesthetics, and also not just the sort of visual aesthetics, but the usability of the area, right? I mean, people walking along the canal and things like that, and of course also paddling. So we've been talking about how to ensure that paddlers have access to the canal, regardless of what kind of solution we use. So that's all, those are all conversations we've been having on the team as well. Other questions or comments? Oh, I see one. Elton, you've got your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. So Dave can go first, but if Dave isn't ready, then I can ask my question. Okay, well, if Dave isn't ready, then I will ask my question. I'm a Manoa resident, a member of the Manoa Neighborhood Board, and I want to thank the Army Corps and the city for deciding to remove the projected detention basin at Manoa Valley District Park. We are very appreciative of that. As Representative Andrew Garrett pointed out, that park is the second most used park on Oahu. So it would really inconvenience a lot of people who use that park on a daily basis to have to negotiate a berm or whatever it is you had planned. So I just wanted to thank you for that. My main concern was what happened at our last meeting when one of the engineers, Mike Elhoff, brought up the question of how would Makiki and some of those other areas, perhaps Mo'iliili as well, how would the floodwaters from those areas drain into, I believe right now there is a Mo'ili stream that drains into the Alawai. So if there are 6-foot walls around the Alawai, how would it be able to drain into that? And I think that was the question that was sort of an engineering question, and Kelly unfortunately was not present. Mike Elhoff, who is an engineer, said, well, it doesn't really work the way Tyson and Eric said it would work, because I'm an engineer, I know what's, how these things work. So I think I'd like to ask Kelly to address that question. I know that's a central question that you have already answered, but I think it'd be helpful for you to tell us what that is now.
Great question. Thanks, Elton.
Okay, yeah, so as part of the feedback from that meeting, I think it was asked several times. So in the document we're preparing to share, and this might be one of the FAQs we end up posting to the website, since there's a lot of interest in it. But it's the concept of flap gates and having the correct head differential, right, to get any sort of local runoff from the protected side of the levee into the canal when the canal has high headwaters. So understanding that, I think that's where Mike and Dave and several other folks were coming from. And so in the write-up, I try to describe the type of storm that we're using in the simulation, and how the timing of all the different subbasins, so Makiki, Manoa, and Pololo, how they all kind of drain at different times. And so your peak flow at the Alawai Canal is not happening immediately. So a lot of the local runoff is going to be able to drain out of the storm culverts before the peak of the storm happens, so before most of the flow is at the canal. And then when that storm recedes, that's when the rest of the water will drain out of the storm culverts. And so in our model, that is no different than what currently happens. Just adding the flap gate will prevent water from the canal backing up into the neighborhoods. On some of the larger, either streams like Houston Ditch or just some of the larger culverts that are there, it's more so of a drainage structure, and I'll have an emergency sluice gate behind it. So in case there is any garbage or anything builds up, you have an emergency way to cut off that backup of water. So I try to go into that a little bit in detail in the response of it. And I guess that's kind of all I can say on that now, but it doesn't differ from the without project condition to with the flood walls in place.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's a good start. It gives me hope. Thank you.
Thanks, Elton. Yeah, and thanks for that answer, Kelly. Yeah, indeed, there was a lot of interest in that, so I'm glad we revisited it. And I'm sure that people will be looking for that on the website and the document we'll be sending out. Luciano asks, how does the EIS detail the management measure tracking spreadsheet so that the reasons for accepting or rejecting alternatives are fully documented with information and data, not just disposed of with a single sentence? Thanks. Eric?
Yeah, so the draft report will have all of the analyses that have been run to support or screen, or I guess retain or screen out individual measures. I will say that this is, we can't go down, we can't run the same level of analysis for every single measure that we look at, right? We had 224, I think, management measures. Some of those were screened out prior to, say, detailed modeling. Some of those were screened out after detailed modeling. And so, essentially the draft report will kind of support decisions with the analysis that was completed. And so that's basically all I can say. The management measure tracker will be included most likely in the draft report somehow as an appendix or as an addendum or something, right? And so that will be there as well. But for a lot of those measures that maybe say some folks would like to see more about, so I'm thinking like the SWIFT tunnels, definitely thinking forest management, reforestation, things like that. You know, those, the more detailed analyses, kind of the model runs and analysis that went into some of those decisions will be included in the report. Kelly, is there anything else that you want to add to that? Over.
I'll just emphasize that, Luciano, you bring up a great point. I think when we're going through the over 200 measures, it gets overwhelming, you know, to write every detail down. But I think for all of the major measures that the community was interested in, we provided a well thought out response to that within the draft report. So maybe the management measure tracker kind of glazed over it, and you know, I do apologize for that. But the draft report will contain more on those really important ones to the community, like the Kapiolani Park detention, maybe the wetland or storage at the golf course with excavation, deepening or widening the canal, et cetera, like all of those, those will have more detailed descriptions on why they were moved forward in the process or why they were screened out. So that will be in the draft report.
And actually, Tyson, if I may, so Luciana, your question kind of brought back so something that came out of the last meeting. So during the last meeting, we talked about the fact that we were developing what we call a supplemental EIS. And so I think that, you know, based off of the comments, there was a lot of concern that the last iteration of the feasibility study, or the last feasibility study, was kind of underpinned by faulty modeling or you know, technical analyses that ended up being revised as we got into this general reevaluation. And so the concern is that, well, how can we be leveraging those analyses in our current EIS? But really what we need to do is we need to remember that there's essentially, it's an integrated feasibility report and environmental impact statement, but they're essentially two different things, right? The feasibility report is going to document all of the technical analysis and then leverage the information that we do in the environmental impact statement. The environmental impact statement is purely an analysis of the environmental impacts and social impacts, right? So we talked about view sheds, we talked, you know, impacts to the stream ecosystems. And so when we talk about doing a supplemental EIS, we're not talking about using the old technical analyses that have since been kind of overcome by new modeling, right? We're just talking about using the environmental assessments, right? So for example, a flood wall in the last feasibility study and a flood wall in this general reevaluation are going to have the same types of environmental impacts, right? They're very, you know, it's a conceptual design, the environmental impacts are going to be the same. And so we're just leveraging the assessments and the coordination and the analysis from an environmental perspective that was done during the last iteration, not all of the technical analysis that underpins kind of those measures. The only other thing I'll say is that, you know, we have coordinated all of this with our sister agencies, right? State, federal resource agencies. And so they are on board and are in agreement that, you know, we don't need to go out and redo all those environmental analyses because again, you know, where appropriate, we can reuse that kind of those environmental assessments. Again, it's completely separate from the technical, say, modeling that underpins them. And I wanted to clarify because I got the sense that there may have been a disconnect there between the difference between the technical analysis and the environmental impact analysis. Over.
Appreciate that, Eric. And I'll just add one more thing, Luciana, that this is actually something that we were talking about the last couple of weeks, partly because we've got, I think on our last meeting, we had a lot of new folks to the process coming to the, you know, to the meeting and participating, which is really exciting to see because obviously we want to, you know, expand our reach as much as we can in the community. But we have been receiving a lot of questions, you know, about measures that we've already talked about in past workshops and stuff. And so we've talked about the need to make sure that the management measure tracking spreadsheet is still available and also that it's updated, particularly on, as Kelly was saying, on certain measures that are, you know, of greater interest than others. So yeah, absolutely on point. So Dave, I want to make sure you have a chance to speak.
Yeah, thanks, Tyson.
You bet.
You know, my main thing is, not the 200, ideas that came forward from the public, but your main element is the walls. And I just don't think, it's going to work. So the basic questions I have are, what's the existing capacity of the canal? And the capacity will differ whether it's high tide or low tide, right? Because it's based upon the energy, because it's a flat area, the height of the canal near Manoa Stream, as it rises, it creates its own flow. And that height of head is what really pushes the water out to the ocean, right? And when I looked at your profiles on the draft EIS and the final EIS, which I was told incorporated sea level rise, high tides, the profiles with the walls never showed the ocean height at 5 feet. The ocean height was always zero mean sea level rise. So I'm thinking, why are you designing walls, when it probably won't work, right? Or it won't give you the benefit that you think we need. So like Kelly was saying, well, the timing, the critical flow and the peak timing varies from subwatershed to water, whether it's coming from Makiki, Manoa, or the far end, it varies. But what Jeff Herzog gave me, all the hydrographs, the flow at the Alawai Harbor or by Alamoana Boulevard Bridge, was like over 15,000 CFS. Okay, so yeah, timing has something to do with it, but when the duration of the storm is 6 hours, and the peak isn't like a peak that you might have in the upper watershed, but at the canal, you're going to have this big flow for hours before it tapers off. And that also means the storm drainage needs to be capped for several hours. It's not just a little passing flow, a little while. And basically, it's like cementing our existing storm drainage system and saying, you know what, you won't flood during the big storm. Unlike the mainland, where you can have a peak flow and sunny skies because you're dealing with melting snow, a month ago, and you're dealing with a storm that happens 2,000 miles in the upper watershed. Over here, when we get a big storm, the intensity of the rain in Waikiki can be exactly the same as the top of the mountain in Manoa Valley. Okay, and to say that, no, we're going to get just a few inches of rain in Waikiki or Mo'iliili, and Manoa is going to get the brunt of it, and design your modeling around that, I think it's wrong. Our watershed is too small. We're a little island, and Waikiki has flooded already on little storms. Why? Because the canal was basically almost full, or we had a high tide. So probability-wise, we've been spared many times because when a big storm, significant storm hits, it's low tide. And it's not as big as the 50 or the 100-year storm. So I don't think these walls are going to work. Water flows downhill. So when on the old design that you had on the FEIS, the wall was 4 feet high by the Manoa Stream confluence. By the time, because water's flowing downhill, by the time it got to the Alamoana Boulevard Bridge, okay, it's ground level. You can't have the water flowing 4 feet straight across, like a plane going from a mile, going from Manoa Stream confluence to the harbor, because it's going to go down here. It's going to be sloped down, right? So now when you think of sea level rise, and that's why I question, I don't think you guys are adding it in, or maybe the computer doesn't factor it in, because one, if you add high tide or king tide, 2.7, at 3.2 for high tide, we're 5.9 feet above mean sea level, right? The ground elevation at Almond Boulevard Bridge is 4 to 5 feet, depending on where you're at.
Okay, that's a great question, Dave.
And like I said,
wanna-
is if you shoot that wall up toward Manoa Stream Confluence, where all the water's coming from, I don't see how you're gaining CFS. You
Right.
guys are claiming the 25, 50, 100-year storm is going to as high as 19,500, CFS, and Kelly's going like, oh no, it's just going, the timing is such that none of it conflicts. I'm like, no, that's not what your hydrographs show. Either that or
Okay.
Jeff sent me a bunch of, stuff that's irrelevant. I don't know.
Right. Okay. I think this is a really good question, Dave, and I actually think that I understood a good bit of it this time. Sometimes I don't understand all the technical questions, but this one, that made a lot of sense to me. So there's a lot in there, Kelly. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, there is a lot in there. So I guess just off the bat, some of the data that you're using is older. And so we've been able to update the modeling since then. We have updated surveys of the canal. There were adjustments made to some bridges. So some of that data you're referring to may not be accurate anymore. And just keeping that in mind, the sea level rise that we're using for 50 years out into the future is that, I don't want to misspeak, let me pull it up. So it includes the mean sea level datum. It's the extreme water level for the 0.99 annual exceedance probability event, and it includes the interannual variability. And all of those are higher than the high tide. So that value, I'm still scrolling. These are very long documents. It's the 3.22 feet mean sea level. So that's what we're using for 2080 right now. And so you don't need to add any more sea level tides, anything on top of that right now. Like that's the value that we're using. And we are still doing a sensitivity. So we're going to be doing a sensitivity analysis on 100 years into the future. How does the project perform when sea level is the intermediate curve, extreme water level, interannual variability in the year 2130? What does that even look like? How's the project performing? So we are looking at that, Dave, and I hope you know we're taking sea level rise very seriously. I know it's a critical component for flooding for the future for the lower watershed. So I want you to know that we are looking at that. To address, and I guess one of the other points you made, so near Ala Moana, so of course we kind of took we looked at 6 feet across the board. Some areas are not going to be 6 feet. Some are going to be lower than 6 feet, and that's just 6 feet measured from the ground elevation up. It's not 6 feet mean sea level. So we're looking at 6 feet across the board. But as we're getting further into design and closer to that tentatively selected plan, we're going to be varying that. And this is not part of optimization. This is just realizing where it's overtopping in our simulation, where we need to correct it, if it needs to be higher, or if it doesn't need to be as high. And then down the road, a little bit further towards our next milestone, we'll be doing that optimization. So what is that actual perfect height with the cost to benefit ratio? So you're right, in that area, Ala Moana Boulevard, we probably need higher than 6 feet. And again, that 6 feet, it's going to be, I think it's around, the terrain data I'm looking at is around 5 feet, thereabouts, anywhere between 2 to 5 feet mean sea level, plus that 6 feet that we were looking at. So that's the feet mean sea level we're looking at, we're probably gonna have to be a little bit higher in that location to account for all of that flow that you're talking about. So with the different tidal events and with the different rain events, yeah, we could be looking anywhere between maybe 12,000 and 20,000 CFS in that area. And so that's why we're going to be looking at some of these locations a little more closely and then varying that flood wall height as needed. I'm sure you had more questions in there, but.
Yeah, I think, Kelly, one thing that Dave raised that I think you've started to address, but maybe maybe it's something we could continue to work on how to answer. I think there's actually kind of two pieces. One is, like I'm seeing Anthony asking for data in the chat. People, you know, on previous meetings have asked to see data and modeling as well. And so I'm hoping that at some point in upcoming meetings, you know, we can have something more to show for folks like Dave who are skeptical about our modeling. Maybe there's something we can show to help illustrate, you know, how you've arrived at some of these results. But also, one of the things that Dave mentioned was, you know, maybe a lack of comfort with relying on the timing of the flood pulses in our design. And so that would be, and I can totally understand that. If I were in the, you know, watershed, that would be a concern of mine as well. So maybe that's another thing that we can, you know, bring something to illustrate, okay, here's how we expect the timing to work, but also what happens if the timing doesn't work exactly as we expect it to. You know, I think you mentioned earlier that there was some sort of fail-safe mechanism. So like that kind of thing, how would we mitigate those sorts of situations? I think the more that we can kind of illustrate that, you know, visually, the better that will be. So I don't know if that's something you can respond to right now, but I think at least for future meetings, that would be great if we could work on that.
Yeah, so all of that detail is going to be in the draft report. And so I know Dave is looking for very specific information right now, and I may not even be able to provide some of that to him right now since I'm not the active hydraulic engineer on the project. I'm just the manager of the engineers. And we can get that to him, but it's also going to be in the draft report.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's definitely coming. It's just a question of when. But yeah, hopefully we can show you some of that. We've only got 2 minutes left in our lunch hour, Talk Story lunch hour here. So I just want to actually go to Eric. Any final comments or closing thoughts that you have?
So just to kind of respond to one other thing that David mentioned in the chat and also in his verbal comment is, you know, the question about the applicability of the models to Hawaii, where the terrain is different, right? And so that was a concern that was discussed within the broader Army Corps team extremely early on. And so we had regional national experts, you know, experts who do modeling in Hawaii and other places that are challenging from a geology perspective, like Puerto Rico. You know, it's where we have very steep terrain, shorter watersheds, very flashy systems. And so, you know, this team essentially took a look at the models, looked at all the assumptions within the models, and you know, verified that everybody was comfortable with how the models were set up, that they would perform well in this system, understanding that it is a very challenging system. And so, you know, I just kind of wanted to note that, yes, it is a challenging system, and that's something that the team has acknowledged from the very, very beginning. And so we did leverage all the expertise, you know, within the Corps, you know, from folks who have experience modeling these types of areas. And so anyway, I just wanted to say that, but you know, I think this was a great discussion today, and I, you know, really appreciate the conversation, and, you know, I'm glad we were able to start getting down to some of the technical issues and questions and concerns that folks had. And so, you know, I think that, you know, we'll continue these. We've got 2 more planned, right? These talk story lunch hours. And so I'm looking forward to the continued discussion. Keep coming with your questions and just appreciate the continued engagement. Over.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks everyone. I completely agree. As Eric mentioned, we've had a lot of top experts working on this, and certainly by the draft report we'll be able to show you some of that work, and maybe a little bit earlier we can show you some pieces as well. So thanks everybody for joining. I know today's was a little bit of an intimate conversation, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but we will get the word out more widely before our next Talk Story Lunch Hour. And so I would expect to have a larger group next time. And I hope you'll all join us then as well. Mahalo.
Thank you.
You.